It was a late Friday night in early November when I got the ping for the ride. I was working an overnight shift for Uber, as I often did, because the extra money was helpful, and the night shifts usually meant fewer passengers and more solitude. The city had been quiet, the usual hum of distant traffic and the occasional siren breaking the silence, when my phone lit up with a ride request from a location just outside the main part of town. The pickup spot was a stretch of road I didn't usually get requests from, an older residential neighborhood that had mostly been replaced by new developments, but still had some older houses clinging to the edges. The address showed as a small cul-de-sac off Old Mill Road. I figured maybe someone was heading to a party or trying to get home after a night out. Nothing out of the ordinary. When I arrived, the street was deserted except for a single figure standing near the curb. She looked young, maybe early 20s, wearing a long dark coat and holding a small bag in one hand. Her hair was dark and pulled back in a loose ponytail, and despite the chill in the air, she didn't seem to shiver. When I pulled up, she stepped toward the car and opened the back door without hesitation. "Hi," I said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Where to?" She looked at me with eyes that were a little too wide, a little too still. "Please take me to Willow Lane." I nodded and started the ride, following the GPS directions out of the neighborhood and onto the older, winding streets that led to Willow Lane, a narrow, tree-lined road that ended near an old cemetery. I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. The night was cold and the mist was starting to roll in, hanging low over the road. We drove in silence for several minutes. I tried to make conversation, but she only responded with short, quiet answers. Occasionally, she would look out the window, her expression unreadable. The road was getting narrower and more secluded, the trees arching overhead as the mist thickened. As we neared the end of Willow Lane, I saw the cemetery gates just ahead. The iron bars were old and rusted, and the gate was slightly ajar. I slowed the car, but before I could stop, the woman tapped my shoulder. "Please," she said softly, "stop here." I pulled over just before the gate, and she opened the door to get out. I watched her step onto the gravel path, her footsteps silent despite the crunching stones. "Are you sure you want to get out here?" I asked. She nodded without turning around. "Yes, this is where I need to be." I waited in the car, the engine idling, watching the fog curl around the gravestones. Minutes passed. Then a sudden chill swept through the car, making the hairs on my arms stand up. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw her, sitting silently in the back seat. But the door was closed, and I was sure I had watched her step out. My heart hammered in my chest. I blinked, thinking it was a trick of the fog or my tired mind. I reached to look again, and the back seat was empty. The door was still closed and locked. I swallowed hard and glanced at my phone. The Uber app still showed the ride as active, with the passenger listed as Emily, the name she had given when she requested the ride. I debated what to do. Should I call out? Should I drive away? The rational part of me said it must be some kind of prank or hallucination from exhaustion. I reached behind my seat, expecting to find the bag she'd been carrying, but it wasn't there. Nothing. The seat was spotless. Suddenly, my phone buzzed with a new message notification, but it wasn't from the Uber app. It was a text from an unknown number. The message read, "Thank you." I sat frozen for a long moment, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling. Then, slowly, I put the car into gear and pulled away from the cemetery gate. The rest of the night was a blur. I kept checking the rearview mirror, but there was no sign of her again. When I finally got home in the early morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the address where I had picked up Emily. I found an old article in the local archives about a young woman named Emily Harper who had died in a car accident on Old Mill Road nearly 15 years ago. The accident had occurred late at night near the same cul-de-sac where I'd picked her up. The article mentioned that she was driving home after a late shift and that her car had veered off the road, hitting a tree just a few blocks from the cemetery. She was found hours later, and the cause of death was listed as blunt trauma. I stared at the photo in the article. It was the same woman I had given a ride to the night before. That night, I hesitated before turning on my Uber app. I didn't want to get back into the car, but I knew I needed the money. Over the following weeks, I worked late-night shifts but avoided that neighborhood. Still, sometimes, after hours of silence, I would get a ping from an unfamiliar location. One night, it happened again. The pickup was on Old Mill Road. I drove there, heart pounding, and saw the same young woman standing by the curb, her dark coat wrapped tight against the cold. She looked at me and smiled softly, the same quiet, empty expression. I opened the back door and she got in. "Willow Lane," she said. We drove, the mist thick around us. The car's temperature dropped, my breath fogging the windows. When we reached the cemetery gate, she asked me to stop. She stepped out into the gravel and disappeared into the fog. Once again, I saw her reflected in the rearview mirror, sitting silently in the back seat. But the door was closed. I was alone. After that night, the ride request from her stopped. I never saw Emily again. But sometimes when I'm driving late and the fog rolls in thick, I feel a chill in the air, and I catch a glimpse of a dark figure standing by the roadside, and I remember that quiet, empty smile. Story, the end. It was a rainy Tuesday night in late October when I picked up a ride request that would change how I viewed driving forever. I'd been doing Uber for a few months, mostly to make ends meet after being laid off from a logistics company. I lived in Riverside, California, and though the work was inconsistent, it gave me the freedom to move around and keep my mind off things. That night, I was driving my Toyota Camry, the rain pattering steadily on the windshield as I idled outside a gas station near the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood. The request came in just after 11:30 p.m., a pickup from a location about 15 minutes away in a more rural part of town. The pin dropped near the edge of Box Springs Mountain Reserve, not the kind of place you'd expect to find many people late at night. But it wasn't unheard of. Sometimes hikers or campers needed rides, and the app rarely lied about the fare. The pickup location was listed as Old Mill Road, and the name rang a faint bell. I wasn't sure why, but something about it made my stomach tighten. Maybe it was just the weather. The downpour had intensified by then, and the hills were shrouded in fog. I accepted the request and began driving. The roads narrowed as I left the city behind. The streetlights grew scarce, and soon the only illumination came from my headlights cutting through the mist. My GPS led me along a winding road up into the hills where trees lined either side like dark, silent sentinels. About a mile from the pin, I lost cell signal. The GPS froze momentarily, but recovered long enough to guide me to a small clearing where an old dirt road jutted off the main path. A rusted mailbox lay crooked by the entrance, and the headlights caught the words Old Mill RD, barely visible on a moss-covered sign. I hesitated. The road looked barely drivable, slick with mud and fallen branches. But the timer on the app was still counting, and I didn't want to cancel on a passenger who might genuinely be stranded. I turned in slowly, my tires crunching over the debris. The road curved uphill, disappearing into a thicket of trees. After a few minutes, I spotted a silhouette ahead, a person standing beneath the branches, not moving, just standing in the rain. I pulled up slowly and rolled down the window halfway. The figure was a woman, probably in her late 20s, with soaking wet black hair clinging to her face. She wore a long, pale dress that looked too thin for the cold, and her arms were wrapped tightly around herself. She didn't approach the car until I called out, "Uber for? Melissa?" She nodded silently and opened the back door, sliding in without a word. The smell hit me immediately. Not foul, but earthy, like damp soil and old wood. I turned back toward her. "Cold night, huh? You sure you want to ride all the way into the city like this?" Still nothing. She just looked ahead, her eyes wide and vacant. I assumed she was upset or scared, maybe a domestic situation or a bad date. I didn't press further. I turned the car around and started the descent back down Old Mill Road. The forest seemed even darker now, the rain pelting harder against the roof. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional squeak of the wipers. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. Melissa sat perfectly still, her hands resting in her lap. We'd gone maybe 10 minutes down the road when I noticed something strange. My rearview mirror reflected her figure, but it was blurry, like the surface of a pond disturbed by a ripple. Every time I looked directly at her, she appeared normal, silent, still. But in the mirror, her outline shimmered, when subtly distorted. I shook it off. Maybe the humidity or condensation on the mirror was messing with the view. When I finally regained cell service, I checked the app. Strangely, the drop-off location hadn't populated. It was just blank. No address, no destination, just a moving blue dot for my location. Melissa? I asked, trying to sound calm. Can you tell me where you're heading? Still silence. I don't have your drop-off location in the app. I just need an address or even a nearby street. I'm going home, she said softly. Her voice startled me. It was calm, but it carried a flatness that was hard to explain, like it came from a place very far away. I nodded, trying to keep my nerves down. Okay, where's home? What's the address? She didn't respond. I looked into the mirror again. This time, her head was turned, staring directly into the mirror. Not at me, but at her own reflection. Her eyes met mine in the mirror, but not with recognition or emotion, just emptiness. The radio, which had been playing low static from a weak FM signal, cut out completely. The screen glitched and flashed, and then the interior lights dimmed for a split second before coming back on. I pulled over to the side of the road. Something felt wrong, too wrong to keep going like nothing was happening. Melissa, are you okay? Do you need help? You're not hurt, are you? She turned her head toward me slowly, and for the first time I noticed her face. It was pale, her lips tinged with blue, and her eyes seemed almost swollen, like she'd been underwater for a very long time. I never made it home, she whispered. A chill rolled over me, colder than anything I'd ever felt. I turned in my seat, heart pounding. What do you mean? But she was gone. The back seat was empty. The door was still closed. I hadn't heard it open, hadn't felt the car shift like it would if someone had stepped out. I was parked in the middle of a dark, narrow road with no shoulder, no lights, and no explanation. I scrambled out of the car and checked the back seat again. It was dry, bone dry. No wet footprints, no damp seat, no trace of anyone having been there. I looked down the road, my flashlight cutting through the fog. Nothing. Just trees and rain and the echo of my own breathing. I jumped back into the car and started driving again, heart hammering in my chest. I drove until I hit the city limits, finally back under the dull glow of streetlights. I pulled into a gas station and sat there for what felt like an hour. I reported the ride to Uber, saying the rider never showed up and I must have hit the wrong pin. They refunded the fare without question, just a generic email and apology. I tried looking up the name Melissa in my past rides. There was nothing. The trip didn't appear on my history at all. It was like it never happened. A few days later, still shaken, I brought it up to a friend who grew up in that area. When I mentioned Old Mill Road, his expression changed. He told me that years ago, back in the early 2000s, there'd been a girl named Melissa who lived near the old mill at the top of the ridge. One night, during a storm, she vanished while walking home. They searched for her for weeks. Eventually, they found her body in a ravine, partially buried under a landslide. She drowned in runoff water, likely knocked unconscious from a fall. Her family never recovered. He showed me an old newspaper clipping online. The photo was grainy, but I recognized her face. The same wet hair, the pale expression, the eyes that looked straight through you. I've tried rationalizing it ever since. Maybe I fell asleep in the car. Maybe it was a hallucination or a waking dream. But I know what I saw. I know I picked someone up on that road, and I know she sat in my car and spoke to me. Now, whenever I get a ride request from outside the city, especially near the mountains, I hesitate. And if it's raining, I turn the app off completely. I still drive, but I keep a small wooden crucifix hanging from the mirror. I'm not religious, but it makes me feel better. Like maybe if she ever gets in my car again, I'll know right away. And I'll take her home, wherever that may be. Story the end. It started like any other night working as an Uber driver in the city. I was new to the job, barely a few weeks in, trying to make some extra cash on the side while figuring out what I really wanted to do with my life. The streets were mostly quiet for a Friday night, probably because of the heavy rain that had started to fall earlier, making the roads slick and dangerous. I was parked near a cluster of bars in the downtown area, scrolling through my app when a new ride request popped up. The pickup location was about 10 minutes away, near a less populated residential neighborhood with older houses and narrow streets lined with tall trees. The passenger's name was Emily. Nothing unusual about that. The app showed her rating was perfect, and the ride details said she wanted to go downtown, near the theater district. I accepted the ride, pulled out onto the wet streets, and followed the GPS to the pickup spot. When I arrived, I was surprised by how dark the street was. The old streetlights flickered sporadically, barely lighting the cracked sidewalks and empty driveways. I rolled down my window and called out, "Emily, I'm here." No response. I checked the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone walking toward the car, but the street was empty. I looked at the address again, 223 Maple Street. A small two-story house sat at the corner, its front porch light burning dimly, casting long shadows on the wet pavement. Something felt off, but I figured maybe she was inside, waiting to come out. I texted, "I'm outside." Still nothing. After a minute, I heard soft footsteps approaching. I glanced toward the passenger side and saw a woman step into the dim light. She was wearing a pale blue dress, soaked from the rain, her dark hair hanging limply over her shoulders. She looked cold and tired, her eyes fixed on the ground. "Sorry I'm late," she said softly as she opened the door and slid into the back seat. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "It's okay, no worries," I replied, pulling back onto the street. "Where to?" She gave me an address downtown, the usual theater district. I started driving. For the first few minutes, the ride was quiet, except for the steady patter of rain against the windows. I stole glances at her through the rearview mirror. She was staring out the window, but her expression was blank, distant. Something about her seemed out of place, like she didn't belong in the world around us. "Everything all right?" I asked cautiously. She didn't answer. I cleared my throat and tried again. "Long night?" Still nothing. It was unnerving. The road was slick, and the rain was picking up. I slowed down at intersections and kept my eyes on the wet road. The city lights were a blur through the rain-streaked windshield. Suddenly, the radio cut out with a sharp burst of static. I fiddled with the dial, but it wouldn't turn on. "Strange," I muttered. Then the GPS started acting up. The screen froze for a moment, then rerouted us down a different road, a back alley I didn't recognize, narrower and less traveled. I tried to override it, but the app insisted. I had no choice but to follow. The houses on either side were older, their windows dark. The streetlights were few and far between. I felt a shiver creep down my spine. I glanced at the passenger seat again. Emily was gone. I blinked hard. I turned around in my seat to look in the back. The door was closed. The seat was empty. "Emily?" I called softly. No response. I pulled the car over to the side and opened the back door. The rain had soaked the floor mat. Nothing else was there. I locked the door again and stared at the empty back seat. My heart was pounding. I looked back to the GPS screen, which now said the ride was completed. I opened the app. It showed that Emily had canceled the ride a few minutes ago. I sat there for a long moment, trying to convince myself that maybe I had imagined it. The voice, the dress, the whole thing. But my phone buzzed. A new text from an unknown number. "Thank you for the ride." I stared at the screen, the rain pelting the roof of my car like a drumbeat. The message was followed by another. "I finally got home." That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept running through the events again and again, wondering if maybe it was some kind of joke or glitch. But I never saw Emily again in the app, and the number that messaged me was untraceable. Over the next week, strange things started happening. My car would sometimes start on its own when it was parked. The radio would flicker to life, playing faint classical music before cutting out abruptly. My phone kept receiving messages from the same unknown number, always polite, always thanking me for the ride. One night I was parked outside my apartment when the phone buzzed again. "I'm cold." I looked around nervously. No one was there. The next day I did some digging. I found a news article from 10 years ago about a young woman named Emily Harper who disappeared in that very neighborhood. She was last seen wearing a blue dress, walking home in the rain late at night. Her body was never found. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Could it really be her? Was I driving a ghost? Days later, I accepted another ride late at night, this time from a man who looked exhausted, rubbing his temples as he got into the car. About 10 minutes into the trip, I saw a flash of movement in the back seat. I looked back, but the man was alone. I chalked it up to fatigue and tried to ignore it. But then my phone buzzed with another message. "Thank you for the ride. Please keep an eye out for me." I stopped driving for a few nights. I cleaned out the car, had a mechanic check it, nothing unusual, But the messages kept coming. The last one I got read, "I'm still waiting." That was enough. I uninstalled the Uber app and sold my car. I don't know if I was ever really driving a ghost or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But sometimes when it rains at night and I'm alone, I swear I hear the soft sound of footsteps behind me. And I see a woman in a blue dress just out of the corner of my eye, disappearing into the shadows. Story. The end. The request came through just after midnight. I'd been driving for nearly 8 hours, the kind of night where the streets are mostly empty and the few people still out seem to be moving through shadows, half alive and half lost. The ping on my phone lit up the screen, a ride request from a part of town I didn't usually drive in, the older district near the riverfront, where the buildings leaned and creaked like they carried decades of secrets. The pickup was on a narrow street called Eastwood Lane, tucked between warehouses that looked abandoned. The destination was a little over 10 miles away, on the other side of the city. I accepted, the app confirming the pickup with the name Anna. No profile picture, no ratings. Sometimes new users came through, sometimes just someone trying to get somewhere fast. I navigated my way through the dark streets, parking under a flickering street lamp where the app showed Anna was waiting. I waited. The night was quiet, but for the occasional drip of water from the gutters, the hum of a distant train, and the rustle of dry leaves skittering across cracked pavement. Then, out of the darkness, she appeared. A woman, slender, pale, with dark hair pulled back tight. She moved slowly, almost gliding, and her clothes were out of place. An old-fashioned dress, long sleeves buttoned all the way up. Her eyes caught the streetlight as she stepped toward the car, glinting like they held some ancient sorrow. She slid into the back seat wordlessly. "Where to?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though a chill crept up my spine. She whispered the address, an old, abandoned neighborhood called Willow Creek, a place I knew was slated for demolition years ago. My fingers hesitated on the wheel as I punched it into the GPS. As I drove, I tried to make conversation, but she said nothing. The radio was quiet, the only sound the tires humming against the wet pavement. I glanced in the rearview mirror. She stared out the window, her face expressionless, but there was something unnatural about her gaze. Too steady, too cold. After a few miles, the GPS suddenly rerouted, sending me down a narrow gravel road lined with dense woods. The car headlights cut through the mist that had thickened around us. My breath fogged the inside of the windshield despite the heater being on full blast. Then the app blinked out, the screen went black. The radio crackled and died. "Anna?" I called softly. No answer. The temperature dropped sharply, and I saw my breath swirl before me. Suddenly, the rear door handle clicked and the door swung open. I whipped around, heart pounding, but no one was there. The seat was empty. I looked back at the GPS. The destination had changed again, this time to a spot deep in the woods. I slammed on the brakes, yanking the door handle. It was locked. I tried to call Anna's number from the app. No signal. The mist thickened, and in the fading light, I saw faint footprints leading from the car into the trees. I didn't follow. I floored it, speeding back to the main road. As I drove, the mist thinned, the radio buzzed back to life, and the app reconnected. When I got home, I looked up Willow Creek and found it was an old town that had been demolished after a massive flood years ago. The neighborhood raced from the maps, but locals said it was haunted by the spirits of those who died there. I never took another ride request from the riverfront. Sometimes, when it's late and the city is quiet, I swear I see a shadow in the back seat, a whisper on the wind, or feel a cold breath on my neck. I don't drive past Eastwood Lane anymore. Story the end. It was a chilly November evening when I started my shift driving for Uber. The streets were slick from an earlier rain, and a thick mist was beginning to settle over the city. I'd been driving rideshare for about a year at that point, mostly late-night shifts since the pay was better and there was less traffic. I was used to the usual mix of people, drunk college kids, late shift workers, people trying to get home safely. But this night was going to be different. I just finished a run, dropping off a couple near the downtown theater district, and was driving through a quieter residential neighborhood when my phone buzzed. It was a request from a rider named Michael. Fairly common name, nothing unusual. The pickup was a few blocks away on a street lined with old Victorian homes, many of which were boarded up or abandoned. I thought it was a little odd to see a request come from that neighborhood so late. It was barely past midnight. Still, I headed toward the address, which was a house on the corner, a large, dilapidated structure that looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. The porch light was on, though dim and flickering. As I pulled up, I saw a man standing on the porch. He was tall and thin, wearing a long dark coat and a hat that shadowed most of his face. He looked up as I pulled in and nodded. I unlocked the doors and he got into the back seat without saying a word. I glanced at the app to confirm the destination. It was a hotel about 15 minutes away downtown. I checked the rearview mirror. His face was pale, almost gaunt, and his eyes seemed strangely vacant. I felt an odd chill, but tried to shake it off. "So, Michael," I said casually, "working late tonight?" Still no response. He didn't acknowledge me at all, just sat there with his hands folded neatly on his lap, staring straight ahead. We started driving. The city lights blurred through the misty windshield. I tried again. "Where are you coming from?" He didn't answer. I glanced back a few times, feeling more uncomfortable with each passing minute. Something about him wasn't right. It was like he wasn't really there. Then, about 5 minutes into the ride, my radio started crackling with static. The music I had playing cut out, replaced by an eerie whispering sound. The temperature inside the car dropped suddenly. My breath fogged up in front of me. I reached down and turned the heat all the way up, but it didn't seem to help. Michael shifted in the seat, his eyes now fixed on me. I caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror and noticed his face was changing. It was still the same man, but his skin looked pale and translucent, almost glowing faintly in the dark. I swallowed hard and kept driving. The streets outside looked twisted, almost like a funhouse mirror reflection of the city I knew. Streetlights flickered, and buildings appeared distorted through the fog. I tried to shake the feeling that we were somehow driving in circles. Suddenly, my phone screen went black and the GPS app shut down. I took a deep breath and asked, "Michael, are you feeling okay? You're awfully quiet." The man's lips parted slightly, and a voice, hollow and echoing, filled the car. "You shouldn't have picked me up," he said. I slammed on the brakes, heart pounding. "What do you mean? Who are you?" Michael's eyes turned completely black. No whites, no pupils. Just empty darkness. I looked down at the dashboard. The car's lights flickered, then all went out. The engine sputtered and died. The car rolled gently to a stop in the middle of the street. Outside, the fog thickened and the silence became oppressive. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal, no data, no calls. "Let me out," I said, my voice shaking. Michael didn't respond. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I whipped around, but no one was there. When I looked back, Michael was gone. The back seat was empty. Panic set in. I tried to start the car again. The engine coughed and finally turned over. I sped away as fast as I could, not looking back until I reached the main highway. The rest of the night was a blur. I didn't take any more rides and the next day, I tried to find information about Michael. That's when I discovered something chilling. The address I picked him up from was an abandoned house that had burned down 10 years ago. The man, Michael, was listed in old news articles as the homeowner who died in the fire. People say he was trying to escape, but never made it out. I never saw him again. But sometimes when I'm driving alone late at night, I get a notification on the Uber app for a ride request. The name always reads Michael, and the pickup location is the same burned-down house. I don't answer anymore. Story the end. The night had already been long, filled with the usual mix of tired drunks, late-night partygoers, and the occasional lost soul wandering home. I'd been driving for Uber in Boston for almost 3 years, mostly late shifts. I preferred it that way. The city slowed down, the streets emptied, and the usual daytime chaos gave way to an eerie stillness that sometimes unsettled me. But I was used to it, or so I thought. That night, the clock was close to 1:30 a.m. when I got a ping for a pickup on a side street near the edge of the South End neighborhood. The app gave an address on a narrow, dimly lit lane called Hawthorne Alley, a place I'd never driven down before. I didn't hesitate. It was late. The fare looked decent, and the distance wasn't too far from where I was. As I pulled my car toward the designated pickup spot, I noticed the street was quieter than usual. No cars parked along the curb, No streetlights except for a flickering lamp near the alley's entrance, which buzzed faintly, casting more shadows than light. I figured it was an old, less traveled road. I parked near the curb and sat idling, waiting. The app said the passenger was about 20 feet ahead, somewhere near a small cluster of row houses with peeling paint and overgrown weeds in their yards. I scanned the area with my headlights but didn't see anyone. Just the quiet houses and the night's heavy silence. After about 2 minutes, a figure appeared from the shadows at the far end of the alley. It was a woman, maybe in her mid-30s, dressed in a long, dark coat, her hair pulled back tightly. She walked slowly toward my car, her movements smooth but deliberate. The closer she got, the more I noticed something odd. Her pale skin almost glowed in the low light, and her eyes looked unusually bright. Almost too bright, like they caught the light unnaturally. When she reached the car, she opened the back door without a word and slid inside. The smell hit me immediately, a faint scent of old flowers mixed with something metallic and cold. It was subtle but unsettling. "Where to?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She gave me an address downtown, a few miles away. I pulled out onto the street and started driving, but the usual chatter from passengers never came. She sat completely still, staring out the window with those bright eyes. The silence grew heavier. My ears seemed to pick up every creak of the car, every distant sound of the city's late-night rhythm, but nothing else. After a few minutes, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The woman's expression hadn't changed. She was still looking out the window, but her face was oddly blank, almost lifeless. Trying to break the silence, I asked, "Rough night?" Still nothing. I swallowed and focused on the road. The streets were nearly deserted, the fog beginning to roll in from the harbor, softening the edges of buildings and street lamps. The temperature inside the car seemed to drop noticeably. My breath began to fog slightly in the cool air despite the heater being on full blast. Suddenly, my phone buzzed in the cup holder. The Uber app flashed a notification. Trip is complete. Confused, I looked at the screen. It said the ride had ended several blocks back, near a gas station I'd passed 10 minutes ago. I glanced back in the mirror again. The back seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes and pulled over. My heart pounded as I turned around in my seat, trying to see if she'd stepped out somewhere unnoticed. But the seat was dry, no sign of movement. I grabbed my phone and tried to call the passenger. No answer. Then the car stereo, which had been off, suddenly switched on by itself. Static crackled through the speakers before a faint whispering began. I couldn't make out the words at first, but the voice was unmistakably female. I rolled down the windows, but the whispers only grew louder, filling the car with an icy chill. I shivered, feeling the hairs on my arms stand up. "I don't know what you want," I whispered into the dark night, "but you can't be here." The whispering stopped abruptly. A silence deeper than before settled over the car. Suddenly, the headlights flickered. The dashboard lights dimmed. The engine sputtered and died. I tried the ignition several times, but the car wouldn't start. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, surrounded by darkness and the faint smell of old flowers. After what felt like an eternity, I heard footsteps outside the car, slow, deliberate, and close. I held my breath, gripping the steering wheel, too afraid to look. Then, just as suddenly as it had died, the engine roared back to life. The footsteps stopped. The temperature warmed. The car stereo clicked off. I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The back seat was empty again, but this time a single wilted flower lay on the seat. A pale white lily, delicate and cold. I pulled onto the main road and didn't stop driving until I reached my apartment. The next day, I went back to the pickup location, but the alley looked different in the daylight, just an old, forgotten street with empty houses and cracked sidewalks. There was no sign of the woman, the flower, or the strange cold air. I reported the incident to Uber, but they found no record of the ride. It was as if it never happened. Since that night, I refuse to drive near Hawthorne Alley after dark. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my car at night, I catch a faint scent of lilies in the air, and I can't shake the feeling that I'm not really alone. Story the end. The night I picked up that passenger still haunts me, and I've driven for Uber for nearly 5 years now. Most nights are routine, the usual mix of late-night workers, partygoers, or people just trying to get home safely. But this one ride was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, and I'm still not sure if what I saw was real or something else entirely. It started around midnight in a part of the city I rarely drove. The Uber app pinged me for a pickup at a remote residential street in an older neighborhood with cracked sidewalks and street lights that flickered weakly. The rider's name was Maggie. No profile picture, which wasn't that unusual, but always made me a little cautious. The destination was about 15 miles away, toward the outskirts of town. I pulled up to the address, a small, dark house set back from the street. The porch light was off, and the front door was slightly ajar. I tapped "Arrived" on the app and waited. After a moment, a woman stepped out. She was dressed in a long white dress that looked outdated, almost Victorian in style, with delicate lace around the collar. Her hair was long, black, and wet-looking as if she had just come from the rain, but the night was dry and clear. She was pale, almost translucent in the dim streetlight. The strange part was her eyes. They were dark and hollow, like empty sockets. I felt a chill, but forced a polite smile. "Maggie?" She nodded silently and got into the back seat without a word. The door closed softly behind her. I glanced at the rearview mirror. She didn't look at me. Her hands rested in her lap, trembling slightly. "Where to?" I asked. She didn't answer. I tried again. "Hey, where are we headed?" Still silence. The app showed her destination as unknown. The GPS tried to lock on but kept glitching, the map flickering between roads and empty spaces. I swallowed hard. "Are you okay?" Her lips moved slightly, but no sound came out. A heavy silence filled the car, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional creak from the old vehicle. As I started to drive, the temperature in the car dropped noticeably. I could see my breath fogging up on the windows, even though the heater was on full blast. I tried to shake it off. After a few minutes, I looked back at Maggie again. She was staring straight ahead, but suddenly her head snapped toward me with an unnatural jerk, and for a split second, I could see a twisted grin spread across her face, too wide, showing sharp teeth that glinted in the moonlight. I slammed on the brakes. "Are you?" But she was gone. The back seat was empty. No sign she had been there moments before. The door was locked. I fumbled with the controls and opened the door, but the sidewalk was empty too. I stepped out, heart pounding. The street was silent except for a soft rustling in the bushes nearby. I turned toward the house she had come from. The front door was still open, but the porch light now flickered on. I called out, "Maggie?" No answer. The hairs on my neck stood up. I hurried back to the car, locking the door behind me. I tried to restart the engine. The radio turned on by itself, playing a low, eerie melody that sounded like an old lullaby. Then the GPS snapped back on, but instead of a map, the screen showed a video feed from the back seat. A blurry, static-filled image of Maggie sitting with her head tilted, staring directly into the camera. I felt frozen with fear. The volume on the radio increased on its own, and I could hear whispering voices mixed with a lullaby, but I couldn't make out the words. Suddenly, the screen changed. It showed the inside of the house's dark hallway. I saw a figure at the end of the hallway, barely visible. Then the screen went black. The engine stalled. My phone buzzed violently in my pocket. I checked the screen, a text message from an unknown number. It read, "Thank you for the ride." My blood ran cold. I was about to call 911 when the car door handle behind me slowly pulled down. I spun around. No one was there. I looked again in the rearview mirror. Maggie was back, pale, silent, eyes hollow. The car doors locked themselves. The temperature dropped again. I fumbled to unlock the doors, but nothing worked. I reached for my phone to record everything, but it was dead. The lullaby resumed on the radio. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. When I opened them, the car was parked back in the spot where I had originally picked up Maggie. The door was open. The seat was empty. My phone screen was back on, with full battery. The ride was marked completed in the app. No fare was charged. I didn't drive for a week after that. I asked other drivers if they had ever picked up a passenger like Maggie. Some told me stories about a woman in white who appeared on late-night rides and vanished. One older driver said he had a similar encounter 30 years ago and believed it was the spirit of a woman who had died tragically on that street. I never went back to that neighborhood. But sometimes, when I'm driving late, I see a figure in white standing by the roadside, just watching, And every time my phone buzzes at 2:15 a.m., I get a text that says, "Ready for another ride?" Story the end. It was a Thursday night in late October, one of those nights when the city air felt heavier than usual, thick with fog and a strange stillness. I'd been driving for Uber for about a year, mostly working late shifts because they paid better, and frankly, I liked the quiet. The downtown traffic during the day stressed me out, but night rides were calm, with tired people heading home from work or drunk people heading home from bars. I didn't mind either. It was around 11:45 p.m. when I got a ping from the app, a pickup at an older residential neighborhood near Oakwood Cemetery. The address was 49 Ashbury Lane. The name attached was Lena. The area was a little out of the way, nestled in a part of town most people didn't go to unless they lived there or were going to the cemetery. The street was barely lit, and the houses looked like they hadn't been renovated since the 60s. When I pulled up to the location, I saw a tall iron gate with a gravel path winding back toward a dark house. I didn't want to get out of the car, so I texted, "I'm here," through the app. A minute later, a young woman stepped through the gate and walked toward the car. She looked to be in her 20s, long black hair, pale skin, wearing a black dress. Not really odd for the season, just kind of gothic. She didn't say much when she got in, just nodded and looked out the window. "Good evening," I said, trying to make conversation. "Going somewhere special tonight?" She paused before replying, "Just going home, tired of being alone in that house." Something about the way she said it gave me chills. I figured she meant it metaphorically, like she was lonely or something. I didn't push. The destination she had entered was across town, about a 35-minute drive without traffic. I started driving. The first few minutes were quiet. I had the soft jazz playlist on low volume, but she asked me to turn it off, said she had a headache. No problem. I turned it off, and for a while, the only sound was the tires rolling over asphalt. About 10 minutes into the drive, I noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. Her reflection. It looked off. Not drastically, but there was a slight delay, like her movements in the mirror lagged behind reality by just a second. I blinked hard, chalking it up to fatigue. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight. Then she started talking. "I grew up in that house, she said softly. It used to be full of laughter. My sisters, my mother, even the dog. But they're all gone now." I glanced in the mirror. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead. "I'm sorry," I said. "That's rough. They didn't just die," she continued. "They were taken." "Taken?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the road. "There's something in that house, something old. It watches, waits. It feeds off you slowly, like rot in the walls." I didn't know how to respond to that. I assumed she was just venting or maybe dealing with grief. People said strange things when they were emotional. Then the temperature in the car dropped. I mean, noticeably. My breath fogged up and the windows started to mist from the inside. I reached for the heat dial and cranked it up, but nothing happened. No air came out. The vents were dead. I glanced at the dashboard. The temperature was dropping, and my phone, which I had docked for GPS, went black. "I don't think your car likes me," she said, finally looking at me in the rear view. That's when I saw it. Her eyes were completely black, no whites, just deep, empty sockets filled with darkness. I slammed on the brakes. She didn't move, didn't even blink, just kept staring through the mirror. The car stalled. I couldn't breathe for a second. My chest felt heavy. Then, just as suddenly, she turned her head and looked out the window. "You shouldn't have come to that house," she whispered. "You let it follow you." "What are you talking about?" I asked, voice shaking. "You opened the gate. That's all it needs." I turned the key and tried to restart the engine. It coughed and finally turned over. The lights came back on. My phone powered up. Everything seemed normal again, except for the deep sense of wrong that was now clinging to me like smoke. I turned to look at her, but the back seat was empty. I froze. I hadn't heard the door open. I hadn't felt the car shift like someone had left. I sat there for a minute, heart pounding. Then I checked the Uber app. The ride was still ongoing, still navigating to her address. I looked around. I was on a long stretch of empty road and not a single building in sight. It took me another 10 minutes to get to the destination. When I arrived, it was an apartment complex. I walked up to the leasing office, which had a light on, and knocked. A young guy in a hoodie opened the door. "Hey, can I help you?" Yeah, I stammered. Is there a Lena here? I was driving her and she vanished from my back seat. She put in this address. The guy stared at me. Lena? He stepped back and grabbed a photo off the corkboard inside. It was a memorial photo, one of those framed pictures you see at funerals. It was her. Same black hair, same pale skin, same black dress. She died last year, he said slowly. Hit by a car a few blocks from Oakwood Cemetery. It was late. Driver never stopped. I don't remember what I said next. I think I apologized and left. I sat in the car trying to wrap my head around what just happened. Then my phone buzzed, a notification from Uber. Thanks for completing the trip. You've earned $18.70. The name on the receipt wasn't Lena. It just said anonymous rider. I didn't drive the rest of the night. I went home, took a hot shower, and tried to forget about it, but I couldn't, because strange things started happening after that night. Lights flickering in my apartment, the sound of footsteps when I was home alone, cold spots in random corners, and always, I'd wake up at exactly 3:17 a.m., gasping for breath, like someone had been sitting on my chest. One night, I saw her again. I was lying in bed, half awake, when I saw a figure standing at the foot of the bed. Just standing there, not moving. I couldn't scream. I couldn't speak. I could only watch as she leaned forward slowly until her face was inches from mine. You opened the gate, she whispered again. I moved out of that apartment a week later. I even sold the car. I couldn't stand being in it anymore. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I expected to see her face. I tried to talk to a priest. He listened quietly and said something that still haunts me. When we let something in, even unknowingly, it sometimes stays, and sometimes it brings friends. I don't drive anymore. I work from home now. But even now, almost a year later, I still get chills at 3:17 a.m. And sometimes when I walk by mirrors or car windows, I catch a glimpse of a black-haired woman in the reflection, always just a step behind me. Story, the end. It was a Thursday night, and I was driving my usual shift for Uber in Atlanta. Most nights were uneventful. Pickups from bars, late-night takeout runs, airport drop-offs. I'd been doing this for about 2 years, mostly for extra money outside my warehouse job. I'd heard weird stories from other drivers, passengers disappearing mid-ride, mysterious addresses, but I always chalked them up to exaggerations or just plain lies. That was until this one ride. I haven't driven for Uber since. It was a little past 11 p.m., and I was parked just off Ponce de Leon Avenue, sipping a convenience store coffee, scrolling through my phone. The air was warm but sticky, typical for August in Georgia. The ping came through. Pickup, Lenox Road, passenger Marie. Only about 10 minutes away. I accepted and started toward the location. As I pulled up, I noticed the street was darker than it should have been. A few streetlights flickered, but the rest were out. The GPS led me to a residential street lined with older homes. Not run down, exactly, but not well maintained either. The kind of place you felt people used to care about, but time had worn it down. I pulled up in front of a white 2-story house with green shutters and a sagging porch. The house didn't have its lights on, but I figured maybe someone was waiting inside and saw me pull up. I tapped arrived on the app. Nothing. I waited a minute, then tapped the horn lightly. Still nothing. Just as I was about to cancel the ride, I saw her. A woman came down the front steps slowly. She was in a long beige coat despite the heat, with a scarf tied around her head. Her skin was pale, and even from the car I could see that her lips were thin and bluish. She walked like her joints hurt, almost gliding more than stepping. She opened the rear door and got in without saying a word. No greeting, no small talk. I glanced back to make sure she was buckled up. She looked straight ahead, never meeting my eyes in the mirror. "Marie?" I asked. She nodded once, stiffly. The app said her destination was about 20 minutes away, an address near the Chattahoochee River, just off a service road I'd never driven before. But the route was clear, and I didn't think too much about it. We drove mostly in silence. I tried once or twice to make small talk, but she never responded. Not rudely, just blank. I figured maybe she was tired or had been through something. About 10 minutes into the drive, I realized the air in the car was cold. Not just cool, cold enough that I could see my breath fog slightly in front of me. I reached over and checked the AC. It was off. Completely off. I glanced back again. She was sitting ramrod straight, her hands folded on her lap, staring out the window. But something was wrong. Her reflection in the rearview mirror didn't look quite right. The angle was off. Like I could see her in the seat, but in the mirror, she was facing me. Her head slightly tilted, eyes locked on mine. I blinked, shook my head. When I looked again, she was back to staring out the window. I started feeling uneasy. The air was too still, and even though we were moving, the usual road sounds felt dampened, like everything was muffled. My tires barely made sound on the asphalt. No crickets. No passing cars, just the occasional creak of my car's suspension. The GPS eventually directed me off the main road and onto a narrower path. The streetlights ended. Trees grew thicker around the road, almost forming a tunnel overhead. I slowed down, headlights cutting through mist that hadn't been there moments before. Then I noticed something else. The destination pin on the GPS was flickering, literally flickering. It would vanish and reappear, and the ETA kept changing. First 2 minutes, then 5, then 3. It didn't make any sense. I was going in a straight line. I pulled up to what should have been the drop-off point, according to the last reading before it disappeared entirely, but it was nothing. Just trees, no house, no path, just forest. I turned to her. "We're here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't move. Her hands were still in her lap. "Marie?" I said again. She slowly turned to look at me, and I nearly flinched. Her eyes were sunken now, and her mouth was slightly open. Her lips were bloodless, and her skin was almost gray. But worst of all, she smiled. Not a kind smile. A slow, stretching smile that looked like it hurt. The corners of her mouth went too far. And then she vanished. One blink, and the seat was empty. My car was dead silent, the air still cold. I slammed the brakes, got out, and paced in front of the car, trying to catch my breath. I looked in the back seat again. Empty. But her seatbelt was unbuckled, swaying slightly, like she'd just undone it. I got back in the car and tried to pull up the ride history. Nothing. No record of a passenger named Marie, no recent trips. My app acted like I hadn't picked anyone up all night. Panicked, I called Uber support. After 20 minutes on hold and being bounced around, someone finally answered. I explained everything. The ride request, the woman, her disappearance. The support rep paused, then asked, "You said the name was Marie, from Lenox Road?" "Yes," I said. "Marie. Long coat, scarf. She was pale. Looked sick." There was another pause, longer this time. "Sir," the rep said slowly, "you're not the first driver to call us about a woman by that name and description. A few others reported something similar over the past couple of years. But that pickup location you mentioned, no one lives there anymore. That house burned down in 2017. The woman who lived there, Marie Allard, died in the fire. She was found near the porch, still in her coat and scarf. They think she was trying to escape when the roof collapsed." I didn't say anything. My throat was dry. I could barely hold the phone. The rep continued. It's not something we have an official position on, obviously, but I'd recommend avoiding any pickups from that address in the future. Most drivers who went there quit shortly after. Mike, I'm sorry for the experience. I hung up. I didn't say another word the whole way home. I kept looking in the mirror, half expecting to see her face again. The next morning, I checked my dashcam footage. Nothing. It recorded me pulling up to the house, sitting there, then driving off. No one got in. No one got out. Just silence. I never drove for Uber again. I still live in Atlanta, but I avoid Lenox Road entirely. Sometimes I'll see a new ping come up on a rideshare forum, someone mentioning a pale woman in a beige coat who never speaks, or a trip that ends at a place that doesn't exist. They never believe me when I warn them. I just tell them to check the mirrors carefully. Sometimes you don't see her until she's already there, and sometimes she never really leaves. Story the end. The night I picked up the stranger from that dimly lit corner of the city, I had no idea that it would be the last ride I'd ever take before my whole life changed. I've driven for Uber for 3 years, mostly late nights. Some nights you get the usual drunk college kids or people returning from parties, sometimes couples arguing quietly, sometimes lonely folks who just want to get home. But that night felt different from the start, off in ways I couldn't explain. It was a cold, misty night in November, the kind where the fog creeps low, wrapping around street lamps, blurring the edges of everything. I was finishing up a long shift, tired but waiting for one last fare before calling it quits. The app pinged Pickup requested at a stretch of road near the old industrial district, the part of town that once thrived but now was mostly abandoned factories and empty warehouses. I'd never had a ride from there before. The address was just off Fifth Avenue, near an old iron bridge that crossed over the river. I glanced at the map. The destination was a block away from a park I'd sometimes jogged through during daylight. I accepted the ride, and minutes later I pulled up to the pickup spot. No one was waiting at first, just the dense fog swirling under the flickering streetlight. I honked softly. Then, through the mist, a figure emerged. She was wearing a long, dark coat, her hair tangled and wild around her pale face. Her eyes caught the light from my headlights and shimmered for a moment before she disappeared into the shadows again. I locked the doors, unsure whether to get out and ask or just drive on. But she stepped forward and suddenly she was at my window, tapping lightly. I rolled it down. "Need a ride?" I asked. She nodded silently, voice barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. "Yes. To the Riverside Park." I nodded and unlocked the doors. She got in the back quietly. I noticed her hands were cold, almost icy, and she smelled faintly of wet earth and something metallic. "Where exactly in the park?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She didn't answer. Instead, she stared out the window, eyes wide and unblinking. I started driving, the fog thickening around the car like a living thing. The route took me across the old iron bridge. The structure groaned under the weight of the car, the metal joints creaking like bones. I glanced in the rearview mirror. She was still there, sitting perfectly still, staring into the darkness behind me. Halfway across the bridge, the headlights suddenly flickered and went out. The engine sputtered and died. The car coasted to a slow stop in the middle of the bridge. I fumbled to turn the ignition, but it was dead. No power anywhere. I looked over at the back seat. She was gone. Panic rose in my throat. I called out, "Hello? Are you there?" No answer. Then I noticed a faint whispering coming from outside. The fog had thickened into a dense white wall around the car. I cracked the door open and stepped out, the cold biting through my jacket. The river roared far below, invisible in the fog. I called my phone again. No signal. Suddenly, a chilling breeze blew through the car, carrying a scent of damp soil and decay. From the mist, a shape began to materialize on the bridge. A woman, translucent and shimmering, her face twisted with sorrow and anger. She looked exactly like the passenger I'd picked up. "Why did you bring me here?" she whispered, voice like the rustling of dead leaves. I didn't mean to," I stammered, stepping back. "This is where I died," she said, pointing toward the river. "Pushed, left to drown." The fog swirled violently around me as the apparition's face contorted in pain. I felt an unbearable cold seep into my bones, freezing me in place. "You are not welcome," she hissed. The car doors slammed shut behind me. I spun around, but the car was empty. My phone buzzed, screen flashing the Uber app. Trip completed. Fare, $22.50. My breath came out in ragged clouds as I stumbled back into the driver's seat, heart pounding. The engine roared to life, headlights piercing through the fog again. The woman was gone. I drove straight home without stopping, hands shaking on the wheel. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. My GPS would reroute me inexplicably through that same old bridge. I would hear whispers through the car speakers, voices crying for help. One night, I woke up to find deep, muddy footprints on my doorstep, wet and cold, though no rain had fallen. I never took another ride from that area. They say sometimes spirits get caught between worlds, reaching out for justice or closure. Maybe she found me because she needed someone to hear her story. Or maybe in picking her up, I unknowingly became part of her nightmare. I don't drive at night anymore. The bridge remains closed now, marked unsafe, but sometimes when the fog rolls in thick and the city sleeps, I swear I see her standing at the edge, waiting. And if you ever get a ride from a ghost, remember, sometimes the fare is more than just money. Story the end.